Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the session, Roland Freudenstein.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's always an uphill struggle after a good lunch to get things going again, but I'll do my best, and so will the speakers who will join us in a second. Just to set the scene, you all, I'm sure, more or less fondly remember your physics lessons in high school, right? Interconnected vessels, Boyle's law, does it ring a bell? That's what this is all about, talking about Taiwan and Ukraine, why global unity matters. So Taiwan is the Russian war against Ukraine fundamentally, existentially connected to the future of Taiwan? Will we deter China by helping Ukraine to win? These, and then of course the question of transatlantic unity. Was an earlier version of the title actually talked about transatlantic unity, not global, and then we changed it into global, because indeed there are countries involved that do not belong to the transatlantic region. But what is the role played by global unity in here? And I will discuss this question and others with my speakers today. And I would like to start with welcoming Dr. Roy Chun Lee, Deputy Foreign Minister of Taiwan. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you.
And we continue with Žygimantas Pavilionis, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Lithuanian Parliament, the Seimas.
Hi.
Cheers. And we have Ivo Daalder, who is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Ivo, welcome. And a seasoned diplomat, I may say. And last but not least, Tobias Ellwood, who's already been speaking a couple of times before, Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom. Welcome. Cheers. So, we start with the Slido poll question, but we will not reveal the answers until halfway into our debate today. We've got 50 minutes ahead of us, and the question to be answered is, will a success for Putin in Ukraine encourage China to use force against Taiwan? So in other words, are these vessels really interconnected? And you know, I might add here, a success for Russia in Ukraine means any kind of territorial gain as compared to the borders, the internationally recognized borders of 1991. So let's have that as the definition. Okay, but as I said, we'll reveal the answers later on. We'll now start with a round of questions to our panelists. And then, of course, there will be time for questions, comments, and answers from and with the audience later on. So I'd like to start with Dr. Roy Chun Lee, Minister. The situation in the Taiwan Strait. Can you give us a short update and explain a couple of principal fundamental terms that are really important, such as the One China policy, the One China principle, the status quo? So we would like to hear from you what the situation is right now. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Roland, for having me and giving me the floor. Let me start by updating you on the situation in the Taiwan Strait. If you are reading newspaper according to the topics, you will realize probably to the conclusion that Taiwan is facing, or the Taiwan Strait is a very dangerous place. But in reality, that's what we are not seeing. We are seeing China's increasing level of military intimidation as a way to demonstrate, first of all, that this is an internal issue. So China has the freedom to fly over an intrusion into our space identification zone. And secondly, it is a way to create fear to our understanding in the Taiwan society. So we're not really seeing an early stage of large-scale military confrontation, but actually we are seeing China increasingly using the military tool as a way to create fear and also as a way to demonstrate that its posture that cross-strait issue is a domestic issue. So, of course, China is trying to isolate Taiwan from the global community. So since August last year, when U.S. former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, we are seeing an escalation of China's so-called military new normal. On a daily basis, we're seeing air warplanes and warships coming closer and closer to Taiwan. Last year, we have a total of 1,727 Chinese warplanes that are flying closer over Taiwan. And on a monthly basis, we have over 22 million cyber attacks from China. Right? So the aggression has already started. But as ours mentioned, our take is that we are not looking. The situation is not as dangerous as many people are seeing this. We are seeing China using those as a way to create fear and of course to divide us. Now let me briefly explain on the status quo. That is the key question, right? G7 leaders' statement argues that they oppose any unilateral change of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, especially through the use of force. But what is the meaning of status quo? In Taiwan's definition, the status quo means, first of all, China and Taiwan have no jurisdiction over each other in the last 75, 80 years. And secondly, Taiwan people and the government has the freedom to decide our way of life and our future through a democratic process. That's the simple status quo that we are trying to preserve. But China apparently have a very different definition of status quo. I think China defines status quo as, first of all, there's only one China, and secondly, Taiwan is part of that China. So what you have been doing, and Taiwan, what we have been doing is actually provocation to China, to Chinese perspective. But China's definition is 100% not consistent with the status quo. That's exactly not what happened in the last 75 years. So that is not his status quo. It's a wishful thinking rather than status quo. So, and finally, about this one China policy, we respect that most countries have one China policy. We have no problem with that. But what we have been sharing with our partners is that, first of all, please don't let Beijing to define your one China policy. Please don't let Beijing to draw the red lines and boundaries of what one China policy means. We're seeing very ambitious program that's being undertaken between Taiwan and Slovakia and also with Czech Republic. And they all consider those are consistent with the one China policy. So it's just a humble request. Take a serious look at what your one China policy means, and more importantly, have your own definition. Don't let China dictate your one China policy.
And the most important thing I think that I might add to this is one China doesn't say which China. And the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party says that of course it's understood that one China means the People's Republic of China.
Right.
But that has never been recognized by Taiwan or the international community. So that's really important to emphasize. And one last question to you, very, very briefly, to be answered, please. So what, in your view, is the connection between Ukraine and Taiwan? Can deterrence against a Chinese use of force against Taiwan be improved by achieving a success for the West and for Ukraine?
I think the connection is robust and straightforward. Deterrence of China's military aggression includes both threats and assurance, of course, but the most important quality here is the determination of the defenders. So what we have been helping Ukraine to win the war, to reach the final victory, is the best demonstration of our determination. And that is probably the most important quality to deter China from making the worst case decision.
Thank you. We'll come back to Chinese actions and so on, and calculations, but I would like now to turn to Pavilionis, and the question of unity on Taiwan and Ukraine. Is there transatlantic unity? Is there global unity on the connection between these two questions?
Well, maybe also replying to the first question and replying to the question you raised. You know, it's not about China, it's not about Russia, it's about us, about you. You know, I'm surrounded by the nations who never recognized Lithuanian occupation. My embassy was working on 16th Street in Washington, D.C., the same more or less in London. You've been supporting us by CAA, MI6, Taiwanese money. We will never forget your cash in Washington for us to survive 50 years without state, without salaries, without sometimes electricity. We survived that fight because you believed and you didn't bow to Soviet Union. You pushed them out. And I'm successful result of your policies. I'm rich. I'm 92% of EU average, and I grow like this. I inspire other nations. And I still remember when I joined the foreign ministry in '93, my salary was $5 a month. A month. It now grew 600 times. I'm happy. And besides, you have Hanna Hopko, who is representing Ukraine. And she is the example of the country where the West started to appease dictators. Instead of having your own agenda, you started stupidly and naively invest into the lions and tigers, giving them all the markets, all the money, all the technologies, at the same time disarming and being divided by them. What happened in Bucharest, you just took the Putin agenda. You know, Putin scared you to death in Munich 2007, and you, of course, believed into him. Oh, no NATO enlargement, no wars, vice versa. So you accepted your agenda because actually the West was fully in the pockets of Putin, making huge, big money. And only after February 24th, you know, when you had to cut your ties, you had some kind of strategy, and now you are moving more or less in a Baltic way to Ukraine. Maybe you will start accession talks with Ukrainians to EU, and maybe, we hope, we pray, you will invite Ukrainians to NATO membership in Vilnius Summit. But if not, I'm 100% sure the sea will make a conclusion. West is weak, corrupted. They still invest into my own economy. I can divide them. So if I occupy this country, they will do actually nothing. A lot of big statements in a way the West was doing after Georgia was occupied. 2 months of big statements, and after 2 months, a huge embrace, resets. Oh, sorry. You know, love Putin. And in 2008, we said, next is Crimea. In 2008, my president, I said the same in Justus Lipsius. So, to make it short, if you continue appeasing autocracies, if you don't finish the war by extending NATO membership to Ukraine, they are next, and we are next.
Tobias, you were pointing.
It was.
You were pointing at Tobias.
My fault.
But I mean, I'm the German.
To make
here.
it more interesting.
So, you know, I'm the German, so please.
Okay. We'll come to you.
I'm looking forward to that. But you know, being German, I have developed a certain routine in being ashamed of my country. So, Tobias, would you enlighten us? You were called up here. About the global implications of the wider picture.
Firstly, it's a real pleasure to be on this important panel. I think this is a subject we're going to be focusing on more and more. But you touch on something which is important, which is the geopolitical changes that are taking place across the world. In many of the speeches I've given in Parliament, I've often posed the question, you know, do we think the world's going to be safer or more dangerous in 5 years' time? And then 10 years' time, 15 years' time? And if the answer to that is clearly no, it's going to get more insecure. What are we doing about it? And that makes us look at ourselves, forget what our adversaries, our competitors are doing. We've given them the space, which I think is where you were alluding to, is the fact that we've given them the freedoms. Authoritarianism is on the rise across the world. They've recognized that there are limits to our international rules-based order. There's something fundamentally wrong with our world when a permanent member of the United Nations can invade another nation. Another permanent member can then endorse that invasion. And then the other 3 permanent members take a little bit of time to get their act together to stand up and provide the necessary equipment and so forth for that invaded nation to be able to protect itself. And it is our weakness, our timidity that is being exploited, I'm afraid, by our adversaries that are now ever working more closely together. There is an alliance that's developing, no limits alliances, they call it themselves, Russia and China. I think Russia and China, the leaders have met dozens of times in person and then regularly through Zoom and so forth, planning, sharing notes, working out what they can actually do, not wishing to rewrite the international rules-based order, but to exploit it. The international rules-based order is actually all about transparency, openness, democracy, and so forth. That's the last thing a dictator wants. A dictator wants to be able to be in power for a long time, to be able to secure that power. So they certainly don't want elections. And I think I've said again in Parliament that Afghanistan potentially was the high tide mark of Western liberal democracy after the Second World War. So we have some soul searching to do as to what we believe in, what we stand for, what we're willing to defend. And I was really shocked by, just in the last half hour, where the Prime Minister of Georgia, that is seeking to join the EU, that is seeking to join NATO, actually blamed the expansion on NATO for the invasion of Ukraine. Now, that is scandalous, that really, really is. But it shows you the coercive nature of what Russia is doing. It shows you how frail the international community has become. And where it then brings together these discussions that we're having here today is that what we're seeing in Taiwan is another example in a different neck of the woods, raising huge questions about global security, Indo-Pacific security, which we're not willing to address. I'm really pleased. I hope the invasion, the counteroffensive actually goes well. It won't end in one go, I'm afraid. There'll be a series of counteroffensives that will need to take place. But I assure you that if Russia is able to hold its line, have a frozen conflict, it will have fundamental consequences for European and indeed global security, because China is taking notes about what is happening here and will put them into action in the Pacific.
I'd like to turn to Ivo now and ask you, there's a lot of criticism in the West, but also in the so-called global South or the global swing states, whatever you call them, criticism about this model of dividing the world into democracy and autocracy. It's saying, A, it doesn't work, there's so many gray zones in between. B, it's not a good thing. C, it will bring us to a global confrontation, a Cold War 2.0, and what have you. How do you comment these voices?
So I think there are democracies and there are autocracies, and that's a reality that is very difficult to escape. In fact, we don't want to escape. Democracies are a good thing. They tend to be better partners. They tend to be more likely to look at the world in the same way. I don't think it is a great organizing principle for international politics or foreign policy. I think those who abide by the rules and those who don't is a better way to think about the situation. And in some ways, that's where Ukraine and Taiwan, as two fundamental security issues of our time, come together. Taiwan is sort of living in 2013, 2014 Ukraine. That's how we should be thinking about this. It is facing a neighbor that is determined to control its future, either physically or politically or economically or all three. But it is determined to say that what happens in Taipei gets decided in Beijing. Just as Vladimir Putin, as he said in 2007, in fact said before, was determined that what happens in Kyiv gets decided in Moscow. We in the West, and we in the United States, have a tendency to look at these problems as the way that happens is a country gets invaded, it gets occupied, and that's how control gets exercised. And because there wasn't just a little bit of an invasion in 2014, Crimea, which is slightly different, and there's the Soviet fleet was there and the Russian fleet was there, and then there was support, overt and covert support for so-called independent movements in Ukraine. We were able to talk ourselves out of saying, well, this is not real. But that was the first step. 24th of February was the second step. What's happening in the Straits, and I was just in Taipei, I was also just in Okinawa, is that the Chinese are starting to understand that the kind of response that the United States and Japan and Taiwan and Australia and the Philippines and increasingly other countries are mounting against the possibility of invasion is such that an outright invasion is going to be very, very difficult for the Chinese to do. And Ukraine actually made it clear how difficult it is. General Cavoli, the SACEUR, once said to me, he said, you know, the largest number of Russian casualties to date have been when they're trying to cross water. You know what stands between China and Taiwan? A very big river. It's very hard to get from China to Taiwan by driving a tank. Really hard. And so they are learning that they need to figure out a different way. And the different way is exactly what Minister Lin just talked about. It is intimidation politically, economically, militarily. It's a quiet strangulation policy that they are squeezing the island to basically give them a choice. Do what we say in order for us to control what you do. And we don't have a strategy for that. Let's be very clear. Buying Tomahawk cruise missiles, as the Japanese are doing, or buying nuclear submarines, as the Australians are doing, are important to deter China from invading Taiwan, but it does nothing to stop the kind of intimidation that the Chinese are involved in. The final point, the exercises that the Chinese did after Speaker Pelosi's visit were an exercise to how you blockade Taiwan. If you blockade Taiwan, Taiwan will be without, will need gas and oil imports within 11 days. Who's going to break the blockade? Who is willing to exercise and escalate that conflict? Are we, the United States, willing? Is the Lithuanian Navy going to do it? Is the British, much vaunted Navy going to do it? Who is going to do this? But in the meantime, Minister Lin is going to say, we're dying here. And so that's the strategy that the Chinese are embarked upon economically, politically, and militarily, while we in Washington spend all of our time thinking about how do we deter the Chinese from attacking, and even worse, having this ludicrous idea that we cannot do Ukraine and Taiwan at the same time. We just need to do Taiwan and let the Europeans do Ukraine. So the bigger point is not about democracies and autocracies, except that if democracies fail in one place, they're likely to fail in another place as well. So we better work these problems together.
I have one last question to our panelists before we open up, but I just want to encourage you to ask questions by Slido. And then later on, of course, there will be a possibility just by raising your hand. Coming back to the interconnected vessels and the connection between Taiwan and Ukraine. There are two schools. One is the one that we basically represent here on this panel, is that yes, this interconnection is there, and therefore Europe, the United States, and democracies elsewhere in the world have an existential interest in fighting both fights, so to speak, in supporting Ukraine and supporting Taiwan in deterring China. But there's another school, which has a very interesting composition of members, which says that, oh, well, you know, Europe doesn't have that much of a stake in Taiwan. Europe should focus on European things. Ukraine, yes, but Taiwan is not so much our fundamental interest. President Macron, in his interview for Les Echos a couple of weeks ago, And strangely enough, there are some MAGA Republicans who are actually saying pretty much the same thing. It's like, let's say it's the other side of the coin, who are saying that, oh, well, you know, I mean, those Europeans, they can take care of Ukraine. We focus on our priority, which is superpower rivalry with China. And that means we support Taiwan. We devote our energies to that question. But, you know, European security is not for American taxpayers to pay for. So what do we make of this? What do we respond to these voices that say, well, Europeans will unfortunately have to choose, or to those who say, America will have to choose, it cannot deal with both things at the same time? Tobias, you go first.
Right. I try to raise it again to say that if you don't get the international institutions upgraded, then what are we fighting for? What are we actually doing, either in Ukraine or indeed supporting Taiwan as well? Because where does it leave you? China is not going away. They're going to be a dominant nation this century. There's internal issues in China, and we can all guess as to how that might play out. But we get this debate, again, going back to British Parliament, where you get the China hawks, so everything to do with China is bad. The difference between the Cold War that I think we're now in compared with the Soviet one is actually the economy that's behind it. China's Achilles heel is that it requires engagement with the rest of the world to keep its own country going. Now, we've not leveraged that. We've not taken advantage of that to say, let's actually adhere and enforce our trading rules across the world through the World Trade Organization and so forth. If we did that and said, this is the club that you have to abide by, if you're not going to abide by these rules, then we collectively will not then work with you. That gives an off-ramp, if you like, a direction of travel. And likewise with Russia, we need to be doing the same there as well. It's giving an indication as to where Russia can actually go. If we don't, we forget actually what the immediate fighting is all about, because all it'll happen is that we'll all die down, as is what's happened with Russia when they invaded Georgia, then they went on to the Crimea, then they did it all again in February. Everybody just goes away for a couple of years, regroups, rearms, and does it all again, because there's no above international order for us to actually control, contain, and indeed encourage nations to then work together.
And Žygis, you were shaking your head when I mentioned these two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
The separated.
I just wanted to say, you know, that it's really time for Lithuanians to become Secretary General of NATO. Because if either you have a strategy, or you are falling the victims of other strategy. There is no limbo. Gray zones invite violence and wars. What NATO did in Bucharest with Ukraine, you invited Russia to occupy Georgia and Ukraine. Invited, because you had no strategy, no clue what to do. Do you have some clue what to do with Taiwan? So if you said that China is a dominant nation, so guys, we have to have a global plan how to rescue democracy.
Exactly.
Because Chinese, Russians, Belarusians, Iranians, all those bad guys, they cooperate so well in killing Ukrainians, in attacking Lithuanians. You know, I can tell stories about cooperation of those autocratic regimes on the spot against a small Lithuanian nation. Not what to say about Taiwanese. So either you have a plan, how you reform United Nations hijacked by criminal and communist and KGB regimes? Do you have a plan? Do you have a plan how to rescue OSCE from those guys who doesn't want to have Estonia lead it for some reason? Do you have a plan of NATO enlargement in Vilnius? Do you have a plan of EU enlargement? If you don't, forget about that. You will pay such a huge price, and you will wait for your Pearl Harbor until you wake up, and finally you hear us screaming.
You keep looking at me. Can I say I agree with everything you're saying?
You can look at me next time.
Here.
Yeah. We'll come back to the Secretary General question. Actually, that might be the solution to all our worries. Okay. We're over half of our time now, and I've got 4 questions on Slido already. So we'll deal with those and then take some from the audience live here. So here are the Slido questions. Martin Jaworczyk says, isn't it easier for China to influence internal Taiwan policy than to conquer the island by military power? Minister, that's for you.
Well, the quick answer is no. It's actually Taiwan's level of resilience is extremely much higher than it appears to be. China has tried to interference into our election the last 10 days. Last 10 years. But every time it failed. to achieve its objective. Taiwan's people always voted for a candidate that is to China's displeasure. So that's one. It's just an example that is actually quite difficult. But that said, we are seeing, of course, similar to other places, a division in the community, in the society, that people take different views. Maybe China's growing. Maybe we can consider to make concession to China's preconditions of one China principle as a way to bring back prosperity. That's exactly what China is selling to Hong Kong. When China is introducing this national security law to Hong Kong, if you look at the poster, it says that take the law and we'll bring back prosperity. That's exactly what China has been trying to sell. That, of course, plays a little bit, but I have to say it's actually not very easy for China to interfere with our domestic politics.
Right. Here's another question for you about the UN Resolution 2758. This is a real expert on international law. So he would like to ask, he or she, it's anonymous, would like to ask especially the Deputy Foreign Minister to elaborate on the legal aspects of the One China policy. So,
okay, now, a UN Resolution 2758 only addresses one part of this, the issue. It addresses the part that recognizes China as the sole legitimate representative of China. The UN Resolution 2758 never mentioned anything about Taiwan's belonging or its relationship with China. So that is, and China has been distorting the meaning and content of that resolution in the last 20 years. So I encourage everybody to go to Google, find the resolution, read the resolution, then you will know it is very different from what China has been trying to project in the last 20 years.
Thank you. Then what can Taiwan's leaders, this is Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open, thanks for the question. What can Taiwan's leaders learn from Zelensky's whirlwind diplomacy and communications campaign? Ivo, yours to answer.
Well, if Taiwan's leaders were allowed to go to all the countries that Vladimir Zelensky is allowed to go, they can show what an incredibly charismatic president they currently have, and they have an election coming up in January, and do that again. The problem is Taiwan's situation isn't akin to Ukraine's exactly, because Ukraine is not only an independent, or wrong word, separate from Russia, which Taiwan is from China. It's recognized as a member state of the United Nations in its own right. So I think President Tsai, who has, when she has the opportunity, COVID intervened in the last 3 years for travel as well, but has had the opportunity to make her case, has done so incredibly eloquently. But Zelensky has it a little easier because, unfortunately, his country is being bombarded to smithereens, and he's suffering an incredible brutality that the people of Taiwan are suffering in different ways and not to the same extent.
And I want to corroborate this, and I think that within the realm of possibilities, President Tsai has fantastically improved the footprint in communications terms of Taiwan. And I read her tweets in Japanese, and it's amazing how she has conquered hearts and minds.
She also tweets in English.
That too.
Wow. Thank you.
I happen to get the ones in Japanese. Okay. So, next question. What have we learned about Ukrainian resilience that might be applicable to Taiwan? Another anonymous one. What have we learned? Yeah, Tobias.
Firstly, hats off to Ukraine in what they've achieved. I was there. In fact, we met. The last time we met was, I think, 3 or 4 days before the invasion itself in Kyiv. I have to say, the impression I got was Ukraine wasn't ready for an invasion. And I don't think if you're honest, were anticipating it actually going to happen. It took everybody by surprise. Even the United States intelligence didn't anticipate it. Then expected Russia to win, because otherwise why would they offer a taxi ride, helicopter ride out for President Zelensky? Thankfully, he said, no, thank you. And more importantly, the Ukrainians stayed to fight. I understand Putin thought it will be a repeat of 1968, or 50,000 troops required then, 2,000 tanks rolling into Czechoslovakia, and they would capitulate straight away. It didn't happen, and it's thanks to the absolute courage of the Ukrainian people to hold that line, to stall the actual initial invasion, and then the support of the Western countries, and I'm very proud of what Britain has actually done. The communications of what President Zelensky, going back to that, has absolutely been critical. But I stress we're now at a tipping point. We really are in what is going to happen in Ukraine, because it is an inflection point as to where European security goes. And just turning to Taiwan, absolutely there are lessons to be learned. But I'm just reminded of an event that happened. I have two little boys. One of them deliberately fell over on his bicycle. I rushed outside to see what was going on. The other boy was climbing the kitchen and into the cookie jar and stole the cookies and ran into the garden so they could eat them. And it's a bad analogy, but what I'm trying to say is what's going on in Taiwan is absolute serious. But I think China is deliberately making the world focus 100% on Taiwan, ignoring what it's doing with its international police stations, its Confucius centers, its One Belt, One Road programs and so forth, taking full advantage of how weak our international rules-based order has got. Which country in the UN General Assembly would now dare to stand up and either criticize or vote against a resolution standing up against China? They won't, and that goes back to the appalling situation of our international rules-based order. That needs to be, I think, a focus on conferences such as this, in addition to the acute of what we need to do operations-wise to liberate countries and to support you as well.
Can I just jump in quickly?
Go ahead.
I think the lesson we learned from Taiwan's perspective is, first of all, size doesn't matter. It's the will and the determination of the people to defend their homeland that it will be the most important factor. And second, the lesson we learned is it is also equally important for the like-minded democratic camp to stand with Ukraine to defend. And so that's exactly what we have been trying. What we're trying to tell the people that, well, of course, it's fearful, it's huge. China's GDP is 10 times larger than Russia. Looks scary, but look what happened in Ukraine. Size doesn't matter. It's about our determination and will to fight. And secondly, we are also sharing with the Taiwanese people that we have an increasing number of friends and like-minded partners who are willing to engage and working deeper into our partnership with Taiwan. That's, I would say, the most important lessons we learned from the Ukraine experience.
Could I just add as well that when I visited Taiwan, it was clear that every time a sortie goes up from China and they cross any of your lines, you have to respond. That's
Yes.
putting more hours on your airframes. It's testing your Air Force even more. It means that those airframes need to be replaced, platforms need to be replaced and so forth, which means more investment from other nations, other support as well. So all this is drying you out, if you like. And this is what China has. They do much better than us because if they can do in 10 years' time something rather than today, because it's easier in 10 years' time, they'll wait 10 years. We don't work in those cycles. We work in election cycles, arguably news cycles. We don't think in that way. China is trying to drag this out as long as possible, but like I stress, using Taiwan very much to distract from what else is going on around the world as well.
Go ahead.
Just two sentences with regard to Vilnius NATO agenda, learning from Ukrainians. Just build your military muscles. Increase your defense spending. In Baltics we have 3, in Poland we have 4, and we are thinking about 5. Be ready, rebuild your military industries. And here I'm looking to German representative, rebuild your brigades. We need one in Lithuania standing just across the border, because we learned that deterrence, doesn't work in an old way. You have to deny Russians from coming, because if they come, like they did it in Bucha, in Vilnius, everyone will be killed very quickly.
Yeah, that's right.
Nothing to recover. So it's about us, about our military strength, and be ready. If you are ready like Finns or Israelis, well, they will think twice before doing it with you.
Leopard tanks.
But here's an EU question, and I'm looking at Žygis here. From Antonia Pup, having in mind the fact that the one China policy is still valid, what role can the EU have in Taiwan? Should the US call for less strategic ambiguity from its European partners, I guess? What can the EU do? I mean, you talk about, yes, we need to step up on the military and the defense front and so on, but EU member states, the member state, the former member state that sent aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait is Britain, and that's not in the European Union anymore. So what can Europe do? And a pointer. You yourself mentioned the connection of economic deterrence that needs to be added to military deterrence.
Well, exactly. Again, learning from Ukrainian crisis. We've been shouting and crying with Poles, Lithuanians and Poles mostly, from 2000. Europeans, please do not invest into this terrorist regime that is growing in Moscow. Don't open your markets. If they are siding with more and more autocratic tendencies, stop the trade. Kill the beast before it does not, doesn't send tanks to kill us. Unfortunately, the West didn't learn it on China. Who is the biggest trading partner of EU? America, Taiwan, China. So you feed the tiger, and when the tiger attacks you, you are kind of surprised. Wow. Interesting. So instead of even de-risking, like you said it in G7, decouple. There is a big risk in de-risking only. Because if tomorrow we are waking up with some little events in Taiwan Straits, your economies might go down in Germany, in most of the countries. And we are Lithuanians, sanctioned by all possible devils in this planet, by Chinese, Belarusians. We trade 98% of our trade is with free and democratic countries, and with Taiwan, with whom we are building a chips factory very close to Vilnius airport. Do you have such a chips factory? No. They will produce 5% of our GDP. So trade with democratic Indo-Pacific nations, decouple before it's not too late. And I'm in Slovakia right now. Unite, guys. We said goodbye to 17+1. Baltics did it, Czechs did it. What about Slovakia? What about the rest of the countries in this communist enslaving format just to divide us and rule? Why don't we unite like actually Chancellor Merkel wanted, 27+1? Let's speak united. If you don't do it, maybe we can do it in NATO. Vilnius, in Vilnius NATO summit, first time in NATO's history, 1/3 of the time will be devoted to our common speech, common communications with Indo-Pacific leaders. Maybe we can build a global NATO.
I'll shortly come back on that.
Yes, just very brief.
Hungary and Turkey are going to have problems with that. Jeff, the Joint Expeditionary Force is what I believe that should be discussed at Vilnius for Poland and Ukraine to join that. It's the stepping stone for people familiar with that to getting into NATO as well, and would send a strong message to Russia. Likewise, I'm going to say it, we need to start thinking about a form of NATO, a security formation alliance, perhaps advancing the Quad, linking up with AUKUS to think about Asian, Indo-Pacific security out there. You can't expect NATO to then repeat its operations interests over here. Don't forget, NATO, the most formidable, potent military alliance the world has ever seen, is actually formally benched. It's actually not able to deal with this fire in Ukraine, put it out. It's right on NATO's doorstep, but formally unable to do anything.
Yeah, can I just add on the Indo-Pacific?
Very briefly. And can I get the microphone to this gentleman here behind you?
I mean, to Tobias's point of an Indo-Pacific, I think what is happening in the Indo-Pacific by the countries who actually live there is something that cannot be underestimated. So yes, Germany has done $100 billion in the Zeitenwende. Japan is doubling its defense budget in the next 5 years and will be the third largest military power in the world. Australia has done a fundamental 180-degree change in its entire strategic outlook towards the world, including its defense policy. The Philippines has just opened up 4 major bases for U.S. military forces to be deployed in the area. The United States has 55,000 troops in Okinawa, 340 kilometers away from Taipei. There is a major, major, major military buildup happening in that part of the world. It just doesn't involve a lot of Europeans as part of it. And so just last point, as going back to my former U.S. ambassador to NATO hat, it's time that the Europeans start spending serious money on defense and take their example from what the Japanese, the Taiwanese are doing 15% increase last year in defense spending, Australia and everyone else. And that, if we don't take that seriously, then we are not learning the lesson of Ukraine, let alone the one we're about to learn from Taiwan.
Great. We've only got like 4 or 5 minutes left. Sir, would you please very, very briefly ask your question and introduce yourself?
Eugene Joly, Honorary Consul of Ukraine in Montreal and President of NGO Ukraine 2050. Wasn't the biggest and clearest wake-up call for the international community the fact that in 2023, a country committing genocide in Ukraine was chairing the UN Security Council? If that was not a wake-up call, then I don't know what is. And I think that today, the only way that we can correct the difficulties and the problems in Ukraine, in Taiwan, and in other areas is for NATO member countries to take the geopolitical agenda into their hands as opposed to reacting weakly to the authoritarian regimes dictating the geopolitical agenda for the future.
So NATO replacing the United Nations? Okay, let's have like one voice here from the panel, please. Ivo, can you answer that?
If you could figure out how to change the UN Security Council, I'd be very happy to figure that out. We've been trying to do that for about 60 years.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, one more question, and then we have to wrap up. Right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Nakagawa, the Japanese ambassador based in Bratislava. I think the panel has discussed how to increase the deterrence in the Indo-Pacific in the topic related today. And reportedly at the Vilnius NATO summit meeting, there might be a discussion as to if NATO should have the NATO office in Japan. And I would be pleased to hear your views on this idea.
I need one volunteer. We don't have time for more.
I thought it's already officially announced.
Yeah, exactly.
It's officially announced, confirmed.
But I would stress that it needs to be an indigenous. It needs to be the countries in that neck of the woods with support of other nations. But it was made sense. You sort of mocked our aircraft carrier wandering through. We simply cannot be overstretched. You know, there's things happening. European security is critical to Britain. And absolutely we have an interest in that neck of the woods. But we need to encourage all these countries that Ivo just mentioned to then invest more in their own defense in the way that Japan is actually now taking the lead.
Slido poll, will a success for Putin in Ukraine encourage China to use force against Taiwan? Yes, 77%, no, 23%. And I remember that was slightly less clear in the beginning, because I read the first results and were like 60% or so for yes. So you have changed some hearts and minds in this panel. And for me, there's just one thing that remains, which is the takeaways. I'm notorious for that. 3 takeaways from this discussion. Well, first of all, this concerns all of us. And it will be up to our determination to shape the future of the conflict, the confrontation between autocracies and democracies. Second, there is a connection between Ukraine and Taiwan, and helping Ukraine win the war means improving deterrence against Chinese plans to possibly use force against Taiwan. And third, we need to be creative. For example, in coming up with new security arrangements. Will there be an East Asian NATO? We definitely also have to combine economic with military elements in creating the perfect deterrence to avoid a conflict across the Taiwan Strait. And Žygis, 10 seconds.
And it's time for Germany not to moderate but lead.
Okay, I'll take that one. Thank you. Dankeschön. And next up at the GLOBSEC Bratislava Forum is a session called The Invisible Warrior, Pushing Back in Cyberspace. And it will begin right here after a short video. Thank you very much.
Thank you.